Hey, welcome to Genre Chat. I'm Caleb Walton, and tonight our guest is Eva Marie Everson. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you on the show. I know I'm really excited to speak with you in person again. We recently started the local Word Weavers chapter
Yeah.
in my hometown, so it's
Mhm.
it's nice to be able to talk face to face after emailing back and forth so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm so excited about your group. It's growing and it sounds like it's doing really well.
It is. It's doing very well. The last
Good.
time, the last meeting, I wasn't able to attend the meeting this month, unfortunately. But the last meeting, I believe there were either six or seven people that had already joined
That's so
and
perfect. Yeah.
were there.
Yeah.
So it was
It's a
it was
good group.
really good, really
Yeah.
good. Had a wide
Yeah.
variety, and everybody's really passionate about it too, taking it very seriously.
I love
So that's
that.
good.
That's just music to my ears.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, first, before we get started, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about historical romance. I know that's something you love to write and have done a lot of books in that genre, but I wanted to take a minute and touch on all the other things that you're involved in. I know you got the Blue Ridge Conference coming up next
Yeah.
week. You're in charge of all the contests and the things there. What else are you involved in lately?
Well, the North Georgia Christian Writers Conference, of course, is a conference I direct. And the Florida Conference, which we had back in early March, is also a conference I direct. I actually did six events in 7 weeks during
Wow.
the period. So it
Oh my
was.
goodness.
I speak at a lot of writers' conferences. It's my passion. I love it. So
hmm
I'm complaining, but it was definitely like whenever I was like, why am I so tired? And then, oh,
I can't imagine doing 6 and 7 weeks. I know we always talk about the
woo.
Blue Ridge hangover afterwards, where you have to kind
Right,
of
right.
integrate back into society. So
Exactly,
I
exactly.
can't imagine doing them back to back like that. That must be
I don't even think
exhausting.
I was, like there was no integration. There was just, I was just coming home and doing my laundry and then repacking and leaving again. And my poor dog was like, where are you going now? So,
That's hilarious. That sounds exhausting, though. I know it
yeah,
always takes a couple of days to kind of adjust back in because Blue Ridge
it
is so,
does.
it's
Yeah,
wonderful and it's
yeah.
spiritually refreshing, but physically and
Mhm.
emotionally, it's very draining by the end of the
Well,
week.
and we go away and we're like in our own world. So we're
hmm
at one time there was like there was before social media. I mean, I remember going to Blue Ridge before there was all this social media and everything, and so there were no televisions in the room. Nobody knew what was going on. In
hmm
the world, the whole world could have collapsed and nobody would have known. And that's so often what happens. I know one time I was at the Mount Hermon conference, and I don't remember what it was, but I know it had something to do with the war, and there were some American soldiers who were missing. And while we were at the conference, and somebody, I don't know how they heard it, if somebody called them or what it was, but it went through like wildfire because we didn't have televisions or anything like that in the room. But it was that the American soldiers had just suddenly been found walking along the side of a road. And of course, we were all rejoicing with the rest of the country, but we were completely out of it. Here the
hmm
mental thing happened for our country. Everybody had been in prayer for these soldiers, and then all of a sudden, there they were, and so we would have missed that. So we kind of get tucked away. We're sequestered, and then all of a sudden we're back in the real world, and it's like oh, you didn't know so and so died, and somebody else
hmm
over a country, and right
Especially nowadays with
dollars a
social
gallon.
media.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember my uncle saying they went on a camping trip, either he or someone he knew went on a camping trip the weekend of the Kennedy assassination.
Oh
And so he
wow.
said they
Yeah,
were completely just came back, hey,
yeah.
what I missed,
Yeah,
and found out
yeah,
everything that
something.
had
Yeah,
happened.
because there were no cell phones, and of course no social media, nothing like that. So, I
Absolutely.
mean, when you went away, you really went away back in.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm working on a novel right now that's set in the 1970s, and I have to keep remembering that you stuck your finger in a phone and dialed, and that you picked up the phone to make a long distance call. You had to ask for the operator, and that whole thing, and how that worked, and just trying to remember what that was like, and making sure that I don't have something like a cell phone in the character's purse or whatever. Everything has to go back to the way it was when you're writing from another era. And we have advanced so much in the last 10 years.
hmm
Oh, yeah, it's a lot to keep up with.
It really is. And especially when you're doing something set in the past like that. I know we're going to talk about historical romance, and I get that even counts. Most people, when they think of historical romance, think way back 1800s or something, but
Oh
that even,
yeah. I don't write
still
that.
counts as a historical novel.
Yeah.
But when you're going back in time like that, how do you keep track of the way the world was at that time, the different current events? How do you go about doing your research and making sure everything is authentic?
Well, for one thing, in the '70s, I was a young woman, so I do think back to, oh yeah, this is what I wore, and this is what we did, and the music and
Hmm.
things like that. One of the things that I do is I when I'm writing this particular novel, I listen only to 1970s music, because the thing
Really?
with music is that it will take you back to a time and a place. You'll hear a song, and oh,
Hmm.
I was with so and so when I heard that song the first time or whatever, and you immediately remember what you were wearing and the car that you were driving and this and that. So that helps. And then I'm also watching shows like Mary Tyler Moore and the Bob Newhart Show.
Mm.
Any show that was popular back in the '70s, it was currently the '70s, that was in that genre. I mean, in that era. Not it was a popular TV show in the '70s, but it was set in the '50s, not that kind of thing. But
Hmm.
genuinely, from the '70s, and there are just so many things that I have forgotten. I just you just don't think about them anymore. Like we didn't have our names and addresses in our phones. We had them, if in business, we had them in a Rolodex,
Hmm.
and you spin that little wheel and look up somebody's number, that kind
My
of
coworker has a Rolodex on his desk, and everyone makes fun of him and talks about why
yeah,
doesn't he just put everything on his computer? And he just, no,
right.
I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm not changing it now.
I mean, sometimes it's just that fluid moment, and you know exactly what it is that you're doing and how to do it, and that's perfect for you. And but yeah, I mean, everything was very, very different, and I don't think that was altogether bad. There were some things that weren't so great, but and the same thing, like when I write books set in the '60s or the '50s or the '40s, I listen to that music. That puts me there. And then I do a lot of research online. I read a lot of old newspapers, that you can find online and things like that. And then just and it's really nice because you can go back and find the old Time Life, and just flip through those magazines and remember. There's also a magazine called Remembrance, and my mother subscribed to it, and then I started getting it. And people would just send in photos and of the things that they found. I'm like, oh, remember these? And
Hmm.
they're just talking about a memory that they had. And so I incorporate all of that. I read it very carefully and incorporate all that.
And little details like that is what makes a setting, especially when you're going to a foreign setting, back
Hmm.
in time or in another
Yeah.
part of the world. Little details like that really put the reader in the moment,
Right. Yeah. And
especially if they
especially if
haven't
you can
lived in
throw a
that time, or
song
even
in.
if they have. Hmm.
Yeah. That was
Yeah.
the thing about The One True Love of Alice Ann, was that I made sure that I was listening to this '40s music, and a lot of it was the big band music. And when they were in the soda shops and things like that, I had, like a particular song, whatever came on, and I go, oh, that's a perfect song for this scene. And
Hmm.
incorporate that. But it's also fun for the reader who remembers that as well. Not just for the reader who says, oh, I wasn't born in the 1940s. Obviously, I wasn't born in the 1940s, but a lot of my readers were. I mean, they were alive then. And I took them back to something that they remembered well, and that they were delighted to remember. So even though those were very difficult times, the war years were very difficult times, there was something that happened within this country where we all pulled together, because we were all of one accord, basically. We had to get through this together, and I'm not sure our country could do that again if we were forced to do that. There were so many things that young people gave up,
Hmm.
and older people as well, but especially young people who should have said, oh, but this is the time, let's just be having fun, and da 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 da, and they were just giving up so much. And I think if we said to young people today, or even people my age, okay, you're going to have to give up your cell phones, there can be no social media, we're at war, what would we do? Would we really be willing to do that? I'm not sure that we would. I'm not sure that we could. I think
And you have to think as
too
well,
much
right before
representation.
that time was the Great Depression, where
Right.
everyone sort of got hardened to
Hmm.
those frivolous things that can be given up, and sort of were
Right.
already, at least in this part of the world, we're already in that
Yes.
mindset of do whatever it takes to survive and get through.
Yeah. I mean,
So
they had
it
just gone
almost
through that.
instilled a really
Yeah.
good character in that generation that they would
Yeah.
have to have and tap into in order to get through what was coming ahead. Not,
Absolutely. Yeah.
just to
And
say
and they
see how
probably
God
thought,
uses the different things that happens.
yeah, they probably thought they were home free. It's like we got through the
Hmm.
depression, and then boom, this thing happens, and it just changed everything. But I think it was that tenacity of what got them through the depression that got them through World War II, and then of course right before the depression they had gone through World War One. So it was a different time. It was definitely a different time. Yeah.
I always thought it was amazing talking to my great grandmother before she passed away, and thinking that she had lived through, was born right around the time of World War One, lived through the
Yeah.
Great Depression, lived through the
Yeah.
Second World War, just all of the life experience that she had and all the
Hmm.
history that she had seen in her life.
Hmm.
Just to see now where we've had, I mean, years of relative peace. I mean, I know there's been a lot
Yeah.
of
Sure.
uproar around the
Sure.
world, but especially in this part of the world, we've sort of
Yeah.
gotten very
Yeah.
soft to a lot of the
Right.
things that
Right. Yeah.
they had to do.
We have not had a
What
world war. Yeah.
Absolutely. What else changes when you go back, when you take a story and you take it to the past? What else changes in the way the story unfolds? Maybe the mindset of the characters and how they think, because you have to keep in mind, not only the setting and the music,
Mhm.
but also the mindset of what was socially acceptable and what you could
Right.
say and do in public, what women could do, what people of
Hmm.
certain ethnicities could do, and it just
Right.
sort of changed the whole psychology of the characters. How have you sort of adapted that way when you're going back in time in a story?
Well, yeah, one of the things I do again is in my research is I look at the old movies that are set. I mean, literally were filmed and set during that time period, not just, the movies that have been filmed in the last 5 years and are set in that time period, but I want the genuineness. I want to see exactly the way things were and how, the social standards were of the day. But one thing I definitely found in interviewing older people is that by and large we really haven't changed that much. They had the same temptations that we have today. They made the same mistakes that we do today. The only difference is, let's say, for example, if you were a young couple back in the 1940s and you found yourself expecting a child before you were married, you got married. Not necessarily do that. It's like, oh well, so he'll see the baby or he'll support the baby or whatever. But in those days, that was understood. And if you didn't, then there was always we're going to send the mother away. We're going to send the girl away for a little while. And her husband died in the war. And so they would just make up this whole story, to
Hmm.
protect their innocence. And now it's like we don't care about the innocence. It's like, yeah, who cares? So what?
And that really put a lot more constraint on not necessarily the choices that a character makes, but on the
Right.
reaction of those choices, the effect that has on the people around them is a lot
Absolutely.
different.
And also there were things that were socially acceptable in those days that are not, maybe not necessarily so much today. For
Hmm.
example, we didn't know in the 1940s and the 1950s and even in the 1960s the effects of cigarettes. And so everybody smoked.
True.
So that was just kind of a common thing. I know I grew up in the tobacco world. I grew up in that part of Georgia where a lot of tobacco fields. Everywhere you look, there were tobacco fields, and there were tobacco warehouses. So you would see them all over the side of the road. I mean, yeah, my family, that's what they did. They grew, they worked out in the tobacco.
Hmm.
And so everybody smoked. Everybody smoked, even kids. I mean, as young as 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, kids started smoking. It was just kind of it was what you did. Because even though by a certain point the Surgeon General said nobody was paying attention to it. I
Hmm.
remember as a little girl going to see my doctor, and I was had a lot of allergies growing up as a kid, and so I'd have to go like once or twice a week and get the allergy shot or whatever. And then my mother and I would go into the doctor's office so he could talk to my mother about my progress, and he would light a cigarette. Good. That's
Or
what doctors
nowadays
do.
you could get sued for malpractice. I
Oh
mean,
my
that would be
goodness. I mean,
a
yeah,
outrageous thing
yeah.
to happen.
Yeah, you don't smoke in a inside an office anymore. You don't smoke in a
Hmm.
restaurant. You don't. you don't see any of those things. But even like things like when you flew somewhere, you got dressed up. Women and men got dressed up
Really?
to fly somewhere. Absolutely. And now, of course, I fly a lot. So I go to the airport, people are walking around in their pajamas. I'm like, but but what's interesting is I did my own little experiment, because I used to, when I would fly, I would wear, a pair of jeans, nice top, sneakers, because you're doing a lot of walking, that kind of thing. And I mean, I was clean and I was put together, but in writing some of the, the stories that are set back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and now the 70s, I started thinking about, when they got on a plane, in Five Brides, one of my main characters was a flight attendant, which of course they were called stewardesses in those days, flight attendant. And I started thinking about this, like, men and women dressed up in those days. And so I started dressing to get on a plane. And what surprised me was the difference in the way I was treated, not only in the airport, once I got on the plane. Often, brought back to first class. The flight attendants always making sure, do you have anything you need? Or are you comfortable? This and that. It's like all of a sudden they're looking at me differently. And I think there's something to be said for that. There's something.
True. It does seem like back in that time period, there was a lot more respect. I mean, I know some people did go without the respect they deserved, but in general, because of the way people carried themselves, because of the way people acted when they were in public, there was a lot more general self-respect and a lot more courtesy offered to other people that is taken for granted now, because we're so comfortable everywhere.
Well, and because we no longer think and care about the other person as we did in those days. There was a gentility that not only that came from women, but also from men. Women were ladies. They were truly ladies, and men were gentlemen. And I grew up knowing all the things that you're supposed to know, like a gentleman walks on the outside. If you're walking down the sidewalk, he walks on the outside, and why he walked on the outside. So even in my writing, I make sure that if I have a couple who are walking down the street, he steps around her, and now he's on the outside, so that he's closest to the traffic. And I mean, this is a really, really old one. But speaking of smoking cigarettes, ladies never smoked cigarettes and walked in public, ever.
Really?
That was a no-no.
So you could smoke, you just had to be sitting down and being ladylike about it.
Yes, you could go to an outdoor cafe and you could have a cigarette, but you never walked and smoked. A lady never did that. So again, it's pulling those kinds of things in. And remembering that even though, I know very, very few people today who smoke. Even the people I grew up with who smoked when we were growing up, they don't smoke anymore, because now we know, and now we're much more health conscious. But even, back in those days, we just, it was natural. Smoking cigarettes was natural, but you never saw a lady smoking a cigarette and walking.
I can even remember when I was growing up, when I was 8 or 9 years old, going into a restaurant and having someone ask smoking or non-smoking. And now no one's asked that anymore. Of course, obviously you're not going to be smoking in a restaurant. And it's almost like it just sort of stopped without anyone realizing it, and became something that went from, you can smoke over here, to just completely, intolerable thing. So
absolutely.
Even recently there are changes. So even if you said a novel back in the 90s or in the early 2000s, you might have some things like that were around.
They're going to say that.
Or the larger cell phones. Things change so gradually. They do change quickly, but they also change so gradually that we forget how relatively new they are.
Well, and that's part of the problem with writing a current work today, is that anything that you bring in that is technological is going to be obsolete almost by the time it hits, the shelves. I was one of my books, Things Left Unspoken, which was set in the like 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. Baker Revell just had it made into an Audible book, and they sent me a copy of it, as a gift. Well, I mean, I wrote it in like 2007, 2008. It came out between 2008, 2009. So I don't remember the story. So I thought, this is fun. So I'm listening to it, and there were things like, slapping the cell phone shut. you know, you know. And I thought, why are they doing that? Oh yeah, that's right, because that's what we had. You
I
know,
honestly was just listening to one of the Gansky's podcasts with the First in Fiction, and Alton Gansky was talking about how he had a very similar experience when some books of his are now out of print. He was self-publishing them to keep them in the market, and he said he was going back through them, and he would go, that doesn't make sense. Why didn't she just pull out her cell phone? And he would remember, oh, wait, I wrote this in the 80s. You know? So he said he's almost been tempted to go back in certain points and make, not necessarily change it to bring it back here, because of course that would affect a lot of different things in the story and the choices that were made, but even put a little heading at the beginning set in 1983, 1994, things like that, just so the reader knows ahead of time to expect those things that they wouldn't necessarily be looking out for.
Right, because it's not, and unfortunately in Things Left Unspoken, it's a time slip. So it goes back into it goes back to the 40s, and then it would come back to, so I was time stamping it. That's good. But, you know, otherwise you would read and go, oh, what year was this? And I love to go to, you know, used bookstores and find things that, like this, you know, somebody who has become famous, but this was their first work and it didn't sell. So it goes, I'd like to go back and see, like, how were they writing then? How were they writing 10 years ago or 20 years ago? And I'm reading, I'm thinking, oh, what year was this? So, yeah, because there's little tells that they're not nostalgic at all. They're not nostalgic. They're just that they're outdated. And that's the difference in writing out of the 40s or the 50s or even the 60s. That's nostalgic. But, you know, anything that you pick up today that was written 10 years ago, it's simply outdated. And it's
Absolutely.
Quickly. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was watching an episode of, I think it was Friends, the other day, and they had the pan at the beginning with the New York skyline, and you could see the World Trade Center, the two towers. And I remember reading that saying, oh, wow, that dates that show.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and no one ever thought at that time that there would be something that you would look back and it would just alarm you that there'd been such a major change, whereas now we pick up on that stuff instantly.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I mean, it was not even thought of in 2000.
Absolutely.
Yeah, or I think it was like what 19. When did Friends come out? Like 1990.
It was in the late 90s, the late 90s and the early 2000s. I think it was. So we just don't think about that stuff. Well, what about the romance element of it? I know, especially like you were talking about what was acceptable and what was unacceptable for couples to do and for you know different places for them to go together. But how do you keep the romantic element fresh every time, you know, so it keeps someone on the edge of their seat and intrigued? And how does that change? How else has that changed is with the romance with the cultural setting?
You know, it's funny because when you said we're going to talk about romance, you know, historical romance, and I think, gosh, I don't think of myself as a romance writer. I think there's a romantic thread in my work, and I think that unless you're writing science fiction, and maybe even then, you know, it's just nice that romantic thread is just nice to have. But it's I don't write according to the romance genre, which means that it's, you know, his story, then her story, then his story, then her story, and back and forth and back and forth. So you have a hero and a heroine. So I don't write that in that formula to make it just, you know, easier to say. But I think there's always, a romantic element. And, you know, again, there's nothing new under the sun. So when I'm going back and I'm reading old letters from, you know, that was written between couples from the 40s and the 50s and all this, even some that I found that were written between a great aunt and a great uncle. And I'm like, oh, you Dickens, you know, wow. Okay, then. That's a picture I didn't need in my head. So, you know.
Well, we did that. We wrote letters. Well, not we, but you know, people wrote actual letters, handwritten letters to each other, and you could be a lot more, you know, emotionally intimate in the things that you said. Whereas now we just shoot a quick text and don't think about it.
Yeah, they wrote between the lines. I mean, now they just blurt it out and say it, but in those days they wrote between the lines. And I think that there's something innately romantic about. Let's say an old, there's an old movie, I'm trying to think of the name of it, but it's got Ginger Rogers and Jimmy Stewart. And he's like, you know, his father is the dean of this really hoity-toity college, and she's a showgirl. and he goes into the city and they meet and he marries her and brings her, but he doesn't know how to tell his family he's married her, so he just enrolls her in the college. And so finally at the end they are able to, they get on a train and they're able to be alone together, and he scoops her up in his arms and he kisses her, and then they go into the compartment in the train, their compartment, and he kicks the door shut. This is the end. Well, we're mature. We know what's going to happen behind that door, but you didn't have to see it. You didn't have to say it. So I think
it was done tastefully. It was done so you could still have a manner of respect and dignity about it.
Absolutely. And there's something so sweet about that, And that's one of the reasons why I do love writing in that era. The book I'm writing right now that is set in the 1970s, and trust me, the 70s, oh my gosh, the 70s. Holy moly, it was bad. It's there was still a remnant of us who were saying, hold on to virtue, virtue, virtue. And so my character, she's engaged to be married, but she is holding on to her virtue, and he is very much in favor of that. And one of the things that he says to her is, I love you so much that I'm willing to wait. I mean, that's how much he loves her. I'm willing to make sure that your virtue stays intact. And he also has this conversation with her daddy, and he's like, I will never do anything to your daughter that you would disapprove of. And so when I finally get them to the honeymoon, they go off on their honeymoon, and the next chapter is a week later. And so this expectation has been building up, but I don't need to take you there. You know what happens. And that's the whole point of the story. That's not the gist of the story. The story is about what happens after they get married, and all expectations of a life that's going to be perfect and wonderful. And isn't life grand? It's not always like that. There's a reason why we say for better, for worse, for richer,
exactly.
for poorer, there's a flip side to the beautiful part of those vows. And so that's the real crux of the story. It's not about what took place on their wedding night. And so I think that when I read romance novels that do that they feel like they got to take you there, I think it kind of cheapens it. I think there's just still something very sweet and romantic about
it. Gives things a lot more meaning. I remember, and this is completely off topic from romance and historical novels, but I remember watching an old documentary about when they were making the original Star Trek show. Yeah. The original Star Trek series, and someone was saying how Spock, while he didn't show any emotion, some of the things he did and said had the most impact of any of the characters, because he was so sparing with his reactions that even raising an eyebrow at something would make the audience just go, oh my gosh, that's so important. Yeah. So just even, when you're being sparing with things and then when you actually say something of meaning, if you're just like putting everything out there, it takes away from the significance of it, whereas it has a lot more impact if you're doing it tastefully.
Absolutely. I think so. I really, I think there's something sweet and totally romantic about that. We lost Doris Day yesterday, and she's an absolute favorite. I know all the movies. I love them. But one of my favorites is That Touch of Mink. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it really crossed a couple of, boundaries in that the Doris Day character meets the Cary Grant character, and he asked her to go to Jamaica with him. And she says, are you asking me to marry you? No, I'm sorry. It wasn't Jamaica. It was Bermuda. It was Bermuda. Mm-hmm. And she says, are you asking me to marry you? And he says, no. And then she says, okay, she makes up her mind she's going to go. And then she gets there and she just cannot go through with it. She breaks out in hives and, and it's a comedy. But you understand, if you've ever been in that situation, that he's this playboy, he's this man of the world. And then the really, really funny part of it is that they do end up getting married, because she ends up going back home with her hives. Mm-hmm. And then he follows her back, and he does ask her to marry him. And then at the very end, they're back in Bermuda, and now it's their wedding night, and he has hives.
I love old movies like that. That's what my parents always watched with me when I was a kid, was old movies and things back in that time period.
Yeah. I mean, it was very tastefully done. It is extremely funny. But at the same time, it did kind of, kind of pushed a boundary just a little bit for that era.
Absolutely. And that's honestly playing with the different things in culture, and that's the whole fun of writing
Yeah.
or reading something back then.
Yes.
Is
Yes.
to experience another world and another
Yeah.
time period.
And
But thank you.
everything was about the
Mhm.
clothes too. We get to talk about the clothes, and when you write in those eras, you can talk
Mhm.
about looking into what clothes they would wear and all of this, and one of the things that I've been just completely horrified by is the 1970s. Like I said, I was a young woman in the 1970s, and so going back and looking at the fashion and thinking, what were we thinking? It was terrible.
And it makes you wonder too. It makes you almost scared to wonder when we look back today on
Yeah.
what we're doing now, what we're
Oh
going to
yeah.
think. Because
Yeah.
I'm too young to have the look way back at old pictures and say, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, what did I do? So I'm bracing myself
Right. Right.
to look
Yeah.
back when I'm 30, 40, 50 and see the stuff that we did and
Right.
wore
Yeah.
now, and the color schemes that people did with their houses and stuff. And
Oh,
you know,
absolutely.
we look
Yeah.
back at
Yeah.
those old shows you were talking about, and they had like the Bob Newhart show thing. They had like the orange carpet and
Everything.
the bright green
Everything. Yeah.
curtains, and we're like, oh my goodness, why
Yeah.
on earth would you pick that out?
Yes,
But
a
that was
lot of
the
orange
style
and,
then. It
and
was modern.
browns. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, but that's what I mean. That's the way it was. So that's what you've got to put in there, or it's not
Hmm.
authentic. It's bad,
Exactly.
but lots of polyester.
Yes, and a lot of that's where the dark wood paneling came in that everybody's
Yes,
trying to get
yes,
out of their house
I
now.
know. Yeah,
That's when it
now
was first
everybody's
coming.
painting over it or
Yes,
stripping it out.
or
Yeah,
stripping it out and putting wallpaper or just paint
right.
on
Yeah,
it and things like
paint,
that. And
paint. Yeah,
so
exactly.
much changes and goes into creating. It's almost like
Mhm.
you're world building, like you almost do with a
You
fantasy novel,
are. You are. And
even though it's the real
it's
world.
fun. Yeah, it
Hmm.
is fun to do that because, you do get to go back and recreate something. It doesn't cost you a dime. You just put it together. I mean, I have
Absolutely.
a notebook and I look for things. I look through magazines and online magazines and things like that. And I'm printing out pictures and cutting them out and pasting them into my notebook. And I'm creating my own little world. That's
Hmm.
the fun of it.
Which is the whole fun of writing in general.
It is. It is. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I have had.
Somebody asked
Mhm.
me, how do you write when like you're going through a crisis? I'm like, are you kidding me? I'd rather live in the world that I'm creating than my own. So I just go right to it. It's like I do my best writing when I'm in a crisis because I can say, I'm just pretending this isn't happening over here. And I'm just going to go over here to my little fake world that I made up. So
Exactly, where you get to
my
do
little
that to
fake
other
world.
people,
Yeah.
where you
That's
get to
right.
ruin other people's lives.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
I've heard that one time. That's the thing. If you're a control freak, you need to be a writer because you can literally control everything.
You literally
everything.
can. Yeah. Yes. Don't
So
backtalk me.
besides the Blue Ridge Conference, what else do you have coming up? I know you said you're working on the book. Do you have any new releases or anything else coming out?
Yeah, I don't. I had 3 that came out last year, and I have been working on this novel that I was telling you about, but I'm also working on a work of nonfiction, which is based on what I've been teaching at a lot of the writers' conferences, it's dealing with the spiritual journey of the writer, and that has that's been wonderful. And it's certainly taken me to some wonderful places. It's quite nice.
That's good.
But after Blue Ridge, then I will be at the Southern Christian Writers Conference, which is in Alabama, the first part of June. And then in the middle of June, I will go up to the St. David's Christian Writers Conference up in Pennsylvania. So that's where that's my month of June, May and June. And then after that, I'm not sure. I mean, I know I've got, different things that are coming up, but I try not to think too far ahead or I'll start to panic. So,
That's good. I wish I could do that.
yeah. It's like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get all this done? So, yeah, I just kind of
Absolutely.
like, okay, these are the next 2 that are coming up. And that's why I didn't even
Hmm.
realize that I had booked myself for 6 events in 7 weeks because I just wasn't looking far enough ahead that I picked up on it until it was, why am I so tired?
And I'm sure with Blue Ridge,
The
there's a lot
airport
of
again.
work that goes into like the contests and stuff
Yeah.
like that. I mean, you've
Oh
had
yeah.
had been judging and reading and stuff for months probably
Yeah.
in
Well,
preparation for
I don't
that.
judge and I don't read, but I have to get them out there. So
Hmm.
then I have to collect the scores, and then adding all the scores up and printing all the certificates and double checking things. Just because somebody adds up the scores doesn't mean they added it up correctly. So I enter the scores in, and then tally them and make sure that they're added correctly and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a lot of hours, but it's so much fun. It's so much fun.
Absolutely.
I know who all the winners are. And so,
And you get to host the award show, and who doesn't love that?
yes, and I get to put on all the bling and get all dressed up. And I bought my little outfit, and my shoes, and my jewelry, and all that kind of fun stuff. So it's that night is really, it's really special. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to seeing you there. I'm getting all my arrangements made for travel and things like that. So it's a really big week coming up.
Yes.
But thank you so much for coming on the show. I have really enjoyed having you.
Before we go,
is there anything, any advice, last minute words of wisdom for writers or for anyone trying to get into historical novels or really any kind of fiction?
Join Word Weavers. That's the first thing. It's word-weavers.com. And we've got a lot. We've got over 900 writers now, and many of them are multiple published, award-winning names that you would recognize. And they started off in Word Weavers, and they're still with us. And I think that's very important. Get yourself to a writers' conference. And I don't, Blue Ridge is a huge conference. Mount Hermon is a huge conference. I think Blue Ridge has become really, really big. If you think, well, Blue Ridge, like 500 people, that might be too much for me. Look for smaller conferences like the North Georgia or the Blue Lake Conference and that kind of thing. Kind of, dip your toe in and wet. I always say Blue Ridge is like drinking from a fire hydrant,
It is. It really is.
Yeah, it is.
And it's one thing if you're an extrovert, it's sort of you can get in there and just thrive in the big in the big pond. But for an introvert, I think Blue Ridge may be very overwhelming.
Yeah, it's
overwhelming for me sometimes.
We see the deer in the headlights look, about day 2. And here's something that I always say. Whether I'm meeting with people one-on-one or I'm standing on the stage or doing something like this right now, don't panic. It is overwhelming, and there's no two ways about it. It is overwhelming. But when you go home, give yourself about a week to digest everything. Do not think that you've got to go home and do everything that was asked of you within the first 10 minutes. I hear, writers will call me and say, "Oh, can you help me?" Because they're expecting my manuscript. They said they want to see my manuscript. Trust me, honey, they don't want to see it tomorrow. They don't. They have got to go back to work. They've been away from their desk. They've been away from everything that they need to do as well. They would rather see it right than see it right now.
Exactly. And I've heard that same thing before. Maybe it may have been from you, actually.
It may be, yeah.
Take your time and get it. Of course, don't prolong it to the point where they think you've forgotten. But they've got so many things coming across their desk, they'd rather have quality than speed.
Absolutely. And my thing is, give yourself a couple of weeks. Make sure you send them a thank you email or a thank you card. And say to them, I am currently working on my project so that it will be ready for you. I will have it to you in a month, 2 months, 3 months. As long as they know it's coming, they're happy with that. But, and it's the truth. 80% of what editors ask for or agents ask for at a writer's conference, they'll never see. 80%.
Really? 80%.
Yes. 80%. Only 20% of what is asked for. And I think what happens is that conferees get home and they begin to panic. And that's why I say, don't think about it for about a week. Just let it all sink in. And then approach it as if it's a job. This is a business. It is a business. And so approach it as if you are about to go into a business arrangement with a huge corporation. That means you want everything to be done correctly, and you want to do it slowly, and you want to do it prayerfully. As a Christian, we want to do it prayerfully, obviously. And so don't think you got to get it done within the first 5 minutes of getting home. Just give yourself a break.
And that's such a shame, because as hard as people work to get to the conferences, and then as much courage as it takes to actually present something to someone and pitch something to an agent or an editor, to then not even send it in, just to get overwhelmed and not send it. 80%. I didn't realize it was that. I knew it was a large number, but I didn't know it was 80%.
80%. And I think that we go home and we start listening to the voices in our heads, or somebody will say, well, did somebody offer you a contract while you were there? Well, no, that doesn't happen. That rarely happens. I've seen it 3 times in all these years where a contract is offered at a conference. But usually there was something going on beforehand. It wasn't like, boom,
exactly. Expectations is a lot of it too, because I didn't know what to expect when I went to my first writers conference. And what I always tell people if they ask about what it's like is it's about connections. It's about relationships. Yes. You're going to learn a lot from the classes. You're going to learn a lot from the keynotes, and you're going to get a lot of good ideas and good learning. But the main thing isn't even the deals that you make there. Yeah. It's the relationships and the connections that you make that are going to pay off days or weeks or months down the road. I mean, me hosting this podcast was from people that I met at Blue Ridge. That's had a devotion in a Hallmark devotional collection this past year because of someone I met at Blue Ridge. I mean, it's just about going and building the relationships, and then everybody looking out for one another.
And sometimes your first conference is not the conference where you're going to get that first contract. It's where you're going to get your feet wet. Whether
absolutely.
A conference or a small conference. And the next time you go, you're going to be like, I'm ready now. Now I know what to expect, and it will be okay. It will be okay.
Absolutely.
Panic. And that's why I think groups like Word Weavers are important, because we keep that going for you. We help you by answering some of those questions like, did you think they really meant it? Or is this what they're expecting? I don't know what that means. I don't know what that word is. Things like that. Those of us who have been at it for a while, we tend to speak in the lingo. We forget that some people don't know what that is. Listen, I remember when I first came into publishing, I didn't know what a genre was. And I'm talking about genre. What genre do you write in? I'm like, is that like a room, or is that like a computer? I don't know. And I had to go look it up. I mean, I was a nurse. We never use words like genre, so.
POV, things like that, the acronyms, a one sheet or a book proposal or a query letter. I didn't know what any of that was when I first started. And it's a matter of learning. It is. It's learning a language. It's learning exactly.
Cindy Sproul's teaches a wonderful class on the lingo. And I think it's I'll say, what? And that's, I mean, just like you were saying, when we talk about, is it AP or CMOS? Well, what does that mean? And, so there are just certain things that we talk about that people don't, like, I don't know what that means. I mean, I didn't know what a book proposal was. I didn't know what a one sheet was. I didn't know any of these things. So
I know my friend Sherilyn Bisbano used to host the show. Said she went in, I forgot who it was. It may have been Jerry Jenkins or someone that was teaching a class, and she was there. And she said she raised her hand. She was almost embarrassed to ask. She said, "Please don't laugh or make fun of me, but what's a protagonist?" And she said, "Oh, no problem. Sorry, I didn't explain that." Because you forget that there are people there that have been at it for years, and there are people there that this is their first time in a writing environment.
Right. Yeah. And even still, those of us who have been doing it long enough will say protag. We won't even say protagonist. I mean, at least that's, like, okay, let me look that up. But if you start, who's your antag? Who's your protag? Or what's your whip? What is your whip right now? What's that? And things like that. And even sometimes, like, I got something the other day and somebody said, my MC is blah, 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 and I don't know what to do about it. I'm like, MC. Main character. I was like, oh yeah, because I was just kind of out of it for a moment. But that's what we're all about, is teaching that stuff. So.
Absolutely. But thank you so much for coming on the show. I've enjoyed talking with you, and I look forward to seeing you next week at the conference.
I'll see you there.
Well, thank you everyone for watching, and we will see you next time.